I've always loved my little slice of paradise, a wetland tucked behind my house that most people in the neighborhood wouldn't even notice if they drove past at 70 miles an hour. To me, it wasn't just a patch of mud and water. It was alive. Frogs croaked in a kind of nightly symphony, turtles sunbathed on every log they could find, and herons strutted across the shallow pools like they owned the place. I sometimes joked that even Bigfoot would have thought twice before disturbing this corner of nature. I had lived here long enough to understand the rhythm of the wetland, the way the water level shifted with every rainfall, the delicate balance that kept it thriving, and I had fought tooth and nail to protect it. Every time I spotted a newcomer dumping debris or walking off-trail, I would be there with my camera and my notebook, quietly taking notes like a wetland detective. I thought of it as my personal mission: protect the wetland or face the wrath of the frogs. But apparently, the HOA didn't see it that way. It started innocently enough with a notice tacked to the community board: proposed road construction through the back property area for community access. At first, I laughed. A road through my wetlands? That's like building a highway through the heart of Central Park. Surely they couldn't be serious. But then I read the fine print. They could, and apparently they would. I emailed the board, politely outlining the environmental impact. I attached pictures: frogs mid-jump, turtles lounging lazily, the rare blue heron I'd spotted last spring. I even referenced local wildlife protection guidelines. I expected concern, maybe even a little hesitation. What I got instead was an email back from the HOA president that read something like, "Thanks for your input, we will consider it." The phrasing was polite. The intent, I would soon learn, was non-existent. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, thinking that seeing faces and speaking in person might make a difference. I stood there, armed with charts and photos, explaining in detail how the wetlands supported the ecosystem, controlled floods, and provided a natural buffer for the surrounding land. I even tried to lighten the mood with humor, saying, "If you pave through this area, the frogs might start a union and demand hazard pay." A few board members chuckled, but none of them seemed to take me seriously. Then came the announcement that would haunt my evenings for months to come: the board had voted to approve the road. They called it community progress and essential connectivity, but to me, it was a death sentence for everything I loved about that wetland. I left the meeting feeling deflated, but also a strange mix of anger and anticipation. If nature was going to be a part of this story, I had a feeling it would not let itself be so easily bulldozed. Construction began quietly at first. I would see trucks in the distance, their outlines blurred by the morning mist, and hear the faint rumble of engines through the trees. I walked down to inspect, notebook in hand, and saw the first orange cones lining the edge of the wetland. It felt surreal. The water shimmered in the early sunlight, peaceful and untouched, while the machines waited silently like predators on the edge of a forest. I knew I had to act, but what could I really do? I was just one person against an HOA with resources, committees, and lawyers. And yet, as I watched the first bulldozer inch closer to the reeds, I felt a spark of determination. I wasn't about to sit back and watch my wetland become a muddy memory. I began taking detailed photos, noting every movement, every track left behind. I called local environmental offices, explained the situation, and pleaded for guidance. Still, the sense of humor never left me. I joked to my friends that I'd set up a frog patrol, assigning each amphibian a watchtower on logs and rocks. The idea was ridiculous, of course, but imagining it made me feel less powerless. And secretly, I hoped the wetland itself would fight back in ways I couldn't predict. By the end of that week, the machines were in position, the workers ready, and the HOA smug as ever. They had nodded politely at my warnings, smiled at my charts, and then promptly ignored every single one of them. And that, I realized as I looked over my little paradise from my porch, was the first mistake they ever made. Because nature has a way of answering back, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to be gentle. The first day the construction crews arrived, I felt like I was watching a horror movie from the front row. The trucks rolled in early, their engines growling like beasts, and I swear the birds above seemed to sense the threat. They lifted off in chaotic flocks, squawking warnings to anyone who would listen. The frogs, my so-called wetland security team, started croaking nonstop, like tiny alarm sirens. Even the turtles seemed to move with purpose, sliding off logs as if to protest. I stood there, notebook in hand, trying to process the scene with the calm of a wetland biologist and the disbelief of someone watching their favorite sitcom get canceled mid-season. I tried to approach the site politely. "Excuse me," I called out to a worker in an orange vest, "you're damaging a protected ecosystem. There are permits and environmental concerns you might want to." He waved me off. "We've got approval, ma'am, thanks." Thanks, that was it, just thanks. And with that, they were back to their bulldozers, chainsaws, and loud, mud-churning machines. I knew I had to step up my efforts. I pulled out my camera and started documenting every movement. I took photos of the tracks in the soft soil, of the reeds being torn apart, of the water that was already beginning to discolor. I made videos of the birds squawking and circling overhead, of turtles retreating into the safety of the water. I even caught a beaver, yes, a beaver, dragging a branch across one of the partially cleared paths, as if it knew exactly what was happening. I couldn't help but chuckle. Maybe nature was smarter than all the HOA engineers combined. I called the local council, explained the situation, and sent photos with frantic captions. "This is urgent," I said. "They're destroying wetlands. Immediate intervention is required." The person on the other end sounded sympathetic but helpless. "We'll look into it," they said. Again, polite words, but action seemed distant. The real chaos started as the machinery moved deeper into the wetlands. Water began seeping into the tracks, turning the path into a slippery, muddy quagmire. The workers slipped. One guy fell flat on his face, mud covering him from helmet to boot. I couldn't help but stifle a laugh. I felt a little guilty, but only a little. Nature seemed to be taking matters into her own hands, and I was happy to watch. Even the animals seemed to up their game. A pair of ducks strategically positioned themselves right in front of a bulldozer, refusing to move. A raccoon appeared to be inspecting a trench, as if judging the human incompetence below. I kept narrating quietly to myself. "Observe, dear viewers, this is nature's version of civil disobedience." At the evening HOA meeting, I tried again. I presented my photos, my videos, and my well-researched arguments about environmental damage. I even warned them about potential flooding, erosion, and long-term property damage. I thought they'd pause, reconsider, maybe even call a temporary halt. But no. They smiled, nodded politely, and declared that progress would continue. One of them even leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, and said, "It's just a little wetland. Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about. That's when I realized something important. They didn't just underestimate the wetland. They underestimated me. And more importantly, they underestimated what the wetland could do when pushed too far. By the time I left the meeting, the sun had set behind the horizon, and the wetland looked calm again, deceptively peaceful. The water glimmered in the fading light, reflecting a sky streaked with pink and orange. But I knew better. Beneath that serene surface, the mud was soft, the water unpredictable, and the animals already plotting their tiny acts of resistance. As I walked home, I couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The HOA had made their move, but the first signs of retaliation were already appearing. Minor flooding had started along the edges of the road, some tracks were sinking into mud, and I had no doubt that the next few days would bring even more surprises. I smiled to myself, thinking, this is just the beginning. They wanted progress. Let's see how well that goes when nature decides to play along. By the end of the day, the machine sat idle in soft, slippery soil, workers shaking their heads, and birds circling overhead like watchful sentinels. My wetland had survived its first assault, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. Little did the HOA know, their community road was about to become the battleground for a very different kind of war. By the third day, the wetland had officially declared war on the HOA. I'm not exaggerating. It was like watching nature assemble its own defense squad while I sat back and narrated the unfolding chaos like a slightly unhinged commentator. The bulldozers churned into the mud, tires spinning uselessly as the soil swallowed them up. Workers slipped, cursed, and wiped thick brown sludge off their helmets. I couldn't help but imagine a group of frogs sitting on the sidelines, holding tiny protest signs and laughing at the spectacle. The problem wasn't just mud. The water was unpredictable, shifting in small rivulets that undermined even the heaviest machinery. Every trench dug for the road seemed to turn into a miniature river by midday, carrying away dirt, gravel, and sometimes the unfortunate boot of an unsuspecting worker. I walked along the edge, notebook in hand, narrating the chaos to myself, half joking, half terrified. If this were a movie, the villain would already be dead. But these guys keep coming back. And then there were the wildlife interventions. I had noticed the beavers early on, quietly surveying the construction site. By day 3, they were actively sabotaging the progress. One clever little engineer had dragged branches into a partially dug ditch, effectively turning it into a dam that rerouted water directly into the path of a bulldozer. The driver couldn't understand why his machine suddenly felt like it was driving on a waterbed. I might have laughed a little, okay, a lot. Nature had just delivered its first strike, and it was delicious. The birds were relentless too. Flocks of them circled overhead, shrieking and dive-bombing any equipment that dared linger too close to the water. One particularly aggressive heron actually landed on the hood of a pickup truck, pecking at the windshield wipers until the driver threw up his hands in surrender. Even the turtles seemed to conspire. Tracks in the mud showed their slow but deliberate crossings, often right where freshly laid gravel had been placed, undoing hours of labor. I did my best to document every incident. Photos, videos, sketches in my notebook. I knew that the HOA would try to blame delays on worker error or equipment malfunction, so I wanted a record. Beyond that, it was hard not to admire the cleverness of these creatures. They didn't plan elaborate schemes, they were just doing what they had always done, and it just so happened to completely derail human plans. Inside the HOA office, I imagined the board members were scrambling. Emails flew back and forth. Engineers came and went, shaking their heads at the softness of the soil and the unexpected flood damage. Contractors complained about impossible working conditions, and a few even refused to come back the next day. The HOA naturally was in denial. Progress, they insisted, was inevitable. I almost felt sorry for them, almost. By late afternoon, the wetland had claimed yet another victory. A partially paved stretch of road had collapsed into a muddy sinkhole, leaving half a bulldozer teetering dangerously. Workers scrambled to stabilize it, slipping, shouting, and falling back into the mud. I stood on the edge, hands on my hips, narrating the scene with a grin. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Road to Nowhere, starring mud, water, and some very upset beavers. And yet, even with the chaos, I remained vigilant. I knew this was only the beginning. The wetland had shown its first signs of resistance, but it had not yet unleashed its full power. Minor flooding, stuck machinery, and animal interference were just the early skirmishes. Bigger events were coming, and I intended to watch every moment, record every detail, and yes, enjoy every bit of it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the construction site lay in ruins, or at least in a very soggy, unstable mess. Equipment sat idle, some partially submerged, some tilted at impossible angles, and the workers trudged back to their trucks with mud dripping from their boots. Birds called in the distance, frogs croaked victory songs, and the beavers quietly surveyed the wreckage. I leaned against a tree, notebook tucked under my arm, and smiled. Day 3, I whispered to myself, and nature is already winning. By the time I walked back to my house, I had a sense of both awe and anticipation. The wetland was alive in a way I hadn't fully appreciated before, and I knew the next days would only escalate the battle. The HOA thought they could build a road through my sanctuary with smiles and polite nods. They couldn't have been more wrong. By the 4th day, it was no longer just construction chaos. It had turned into full-scale warfare. And nature, it seemed, had declared herself the general in command. I watched from my porch as the site became unrecognizable. Muddy trenches that had been carefully dug were now little rivers, carved overnight by rainfall that seemed perfectly timed. Equipment that had survived yesterday's skirmish was now teetering in waterlogged soil, engines coughing in protest. It was like the wetland had a secret calendar and had chosen this exact moment to strike back. The beavers, of course, were the most organized participants. One particularly industrious pair had rebuilt a fallen dam, redirecting water straight into the path of a grader. The operator tried to push forward, tires spinning, until the machine ground to a halt. I could hear his exasperated shouts from across the water, and I resisted the urge to laugh out loud. "I swear," I muttered to myself, "they have a plan." I even considered posting a dramatic slow-motion video of the beaver sabotage online. It was that cinematic. Birds joined the campaign with remarkable persistence. Flocks of seagulls and crows swooped overhead, dive-bombing any worker who lingered too long on the partially cleared road. One bold heron actually landed on a bulldozer and flapped its wings violently until the driver jumped back. Even the smaller birds, the songbirds I'd always admired, seemed to sense the tension, chirping alarms like tiny air raid sirens. I joked to a neighbor that if this escalated much further, the HOA would need to hire a wildlife whisperer instead of an engineer. And the frogs, oh, the frogs. Normally quiet at this time of year, they suddenly became extraordinarily vocal, their croaks filling the air with an almost comical insistence. I swear it sounded like they were chanting in unison. "Stop, stop, stop." I recorded it on my phone, knowing that in the future, if anyone doubted my story, the frogs would serve as irrefutable evidence that the wetland had its own will. The workers were clearly reaching their breaking point. One man slipped into a shallow pond, his boots vanishing into the mud, while another tried to drag a hose across a flooded trench only to have it swept away by a mini torrent. There was shouting, cursing, and wild gesturing, but nothing could overcome the combination of mud, water, and relentless wildlife. Meanwhile, the HOA members were perched in their office, furiously texting and calling engineers, their faces pale with worry and frustration. Progress, it turned out, was becoming extremely difficult. I moved closer to the edge of the wetland, notebook and camera ready, narrating every absurd turn of events to myself. There's a strange kind of thrill in watching chaos unfold in slow motion when you know the outcome is likely to favor the underdog. I reminded myself that this wasn't just fun, it was documentation. One day, people would need proof that this wasn't exaggeration, that the wetland had, in fact, fought back in ways no human plan could anticipate. By late afternoon, nature had claimed another victory. A partially built stretch of road had collapsed entirely, swallowed by mud and water. Workers tried to salvage what they could, but every movement seemed to provoke a new setback. One unlucky truck slid halfway into a pond, spilling tools and gravel, while a flock of birds landed on its hood, pecking and flapping, until the driver swatted them away in a futile attempt at control. I couldn't stop myself from chuckling. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming. This wasn't just about a road anymore. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that nature is neither predictable nor polite. The HOA had assumed they could bulldoze, dredge, and pave their way to progress, but the wetland was teaching them something very different. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the flooded construction site, I sat on my porch and reflected. The machines were stuck, the road half destroyed, and the wildlife had won multiple skirmishes without breaking a sweat. The HOA would probably try to blame unforeseen conditions, but anyone watching could see what was really happening. The wetland was alive, clever, and relentless. I closed my notebook, feeling a mixture of awe and anticipation. Nature had made its move, and it was clear there was much more to come. I smiled to myself and whispered, "If you think you can bully a wetland, think again. This is only day 4. The stage was set. The conflict was no longer hypothetical. The HOA wanted progress, nature wanted survival, and I had a front row seat to watch the chaos unfold. By the 5th day, the HOA had officially lost control, or at least, that's what it felt like from my vantage point. Inside their pristine office, I imagined them packing, muttering, and furiously waving spreadsheets at each other while outside. The wetland continued to wreak havoc like a perfectly choreographed revenge performance. I half expected them to hire a mediator just to negotiate with the beavers. Construction crews were openly frustrated. One guy had attempted to drag a bag of gravel across a partially flooded stretch, only to have it sink instantly into a soft mud pocket. Another slipped while hauling tools, ending up halfway into a trench and looking like a drowned rat. I tried not to laugh too loudly, but I couldn't help it. Watching human arrogance collide with wetland reality was surprisingly satisfying. Meanwhile, the wildlife was getting bolder by the hour. The beavers were constructing what could only be described as a barricade system, diverting streams directly into areas that were meant to be dry. Birds perched on machinery, pecking and fluttering like they owned the place, while frogs croaked insistently from every corner. Even the turtles seemed to be taking sides, strategically crossing the muddy tracks and undoing hours of labor with each slow, deliberate step. I narrated every moment for myself, half as a mental log and half as entertainment. Observe, dear viewers, the unstoppable forces of nature meeting human stubbornness head-on. Inside the HOA office, panic was spreading like wildfire. Emails flew back and forth with increasingly desperate tones. "We need a solution immediately," one read. Another suggested covering the wetland with sand, as if a few truckloads could overpower centuries of natural equilibrium. Engineers were called in, but every suggestion they made failed spectacularly. Even temporary barriers collapsed within hours, undermined by water and wildlife alike. I had to admit, part of me felt a little guilty. Not for nature, of course, it had earned every victory, but for the humans struggling so mightily. They had assumed that a road could be carved through my sanctuary with nothing more than confidence and polite nods. Instead, they faced chaos that no spreadsheet, no contractor, and certainly no committee could control. It was equal parts impressive and hilarious. The wetland itself seemed to revel in the chaos. Floodwaters rose in unexpected pockets, washing away freshly laid gravel. Mudslides emerged where none had been before, swallowing tools and flattening partially built embankments. Birds flocked to the edges of equipment, dive-bombing anyone who dared approach. And the frogs, oh, the frogs were louder than ever, croaking in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like chanting. I kept thinking, these little guys are conducting a full-scale protest, and I am here to document it. By mid-afternoon, the HOA had decided to send the president to inspect the site personally. I watched from my porch as he stepped gingerly across the mud, clipboard in hand, muttering under his breath about unforeseen challenges and minor setbacks. At one point, he nearly fell into a trench, only to be saved by an embarrassed contractor. I smiled quietly. Karma, it seemed, had impeccable timing. Neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the spectacle. Some whispered in awe about the wetland's resilience, while others grumbled about the inconvenience of the stalled road. A few brave souls even offered me small gestures of solidarity, snacks, coffee, and sympathetic nods, clearly understanding that I wasn't just documenting the scene, I was a participant in this silent war of wills. As evening approached, the construction site looked like a battlefield. Mud, water, and debris were everywhere. Equipment sat abandoned, partially submerged, and wildlife roamed freely, seemingly unbothered by the humans who had tried to impose their will. I leaned against a tree, notebook in hand, and allowed myself a small, quiet sense of victory. Nature had made its point, and the HOA was scrambling to keep up. I reflected on what had happened so far. The wetland wasn't just surviving, it was actively resisting. Every effort to impose human order had been met with clever, persistent, and sometimes humorous sabotage by wildlife. I felt a growing sense of anticipation. If things had escalated this much in just 5 days, what would the next few days bring? The sun set over the flooded, chaotic construction site, casting long shadows across the mud and water. Frogs croaked their evening song, birds settled on the edges of machinery, and I sat on my porch, notebook tucked under my arm, quietly observing. The HOA wanted progress. Nature wanted survival. And I had a front row seat to the unfolding spectacle, and I wasn't about to miss a single moment. By the 6th day, the battle lines were clear. The HOA was floundering, and the wetland had officially taken control. Engineers had been called in with blueprints, plans, and elaborate calculations, but it quickly became obvious that no human scheme could tame the stubborn stretch of earth and water. I watched with a mixture of awe and amusement as trucks sank halfway into mud pits, cranes teetered on unstable embankments, and workers tried to balance gravel while battling rising floodwaters. It was chaos at its finest, orchestrated entirely by nature. The wetland itself seemed emboldened. Small streams carved new paths overnight, redirecting water into areas that had been cleared the previous day. Beavers had added more barricades, branches, and debris, forming intricate dams that forced even the heaviest machinery to stop. Birds patrolled the skis relentlessly, swooping down at any worker who lingered too close to water or equipment. Even turtles appeared strategic, moving deliberately across muddy patches and effectively undoing hours of human labor. I began to think of them not as animals, but as tiny generals in an organized resistance. Inside the HOA office, the mood was increasingly frantic. Emails and phone calls flew back and forth, with words like emergency, mitigation, and catastrophic failure appearing more frequently than progress or planning. I could almost hear the collective panic as the engineers tried, and repeatedly failed, to impose order. "We need to reinforce the embankment," one memo read. 2 hours later, half of it had already collapsed into a mud pit. The workers were frustrated, exhausted, and more than a little terrified. I saw one man attempt to haul a piece of machinery across a muddy stretch, only to have it slip, slide, and eventually tip into a shallow trench. He stood up, drenched in mud, shaking his head in disbelief. I couldn't stop myself from narrating his struggle in my mind like a sports commentator. "And there goes the excavator, it's sliding, the crowd goes wild. Oh no, it's sinking." The absurdity of it all was overwhelming, and yet entirely deserved. Meanwhile, the wetland showed no mercy. Overnight, small sinkholes opened in places that had seemed solid, swallowing gravel, tools, and even partially laid foundations. Water flowed unpredictably, undermining every attempt to stabilize the site. Birds called from above, their cries echoing across the flooded road like a war chant. Frogs croaked insistently, adding to the cacophony of natural protest. Even I had to admit that I had never seen anything like this. The wetland had transformed from peaceful refuge into a tactical battlefield, and the HOA had stumbled straight into it. Neighbors began to notice the spectacle as well. Some came by to gawk, others to commiserate with me, and a few even cheered quietly for the wetland. I overheard one elderly man say, "I haven't seen the HOA this flustered since they tried to repaint the community mailbox neon green." I smiled. It was comforting to know that, in this small corner of the world, humans weren't entirely in control, and maybe never would be. By mid-afternoon, the construction site was more disaster than development. Equipment was partially submerged, trenches filled with water, and workers tiptoed across mud like tightrope walkers. Engineers paced and muttered, making frantic adjustments that were promptly undone by rising water, collapsing embankments, or wildlife interference. At one point, a flock of crows swooped down and scattered gravel along a newly paved stretch, sending workers into a flurry of useless activity. I couldn't resist narrating it to myself. And there goes the freshly laid gravel, courtesy of Mother Nature's very own landscaping crew. The HOA president finally showed up again, his usually crisp shirt now streaked with mud, clipboard soggy, and hair sticking out at odd angles. I watched him stumble across the site, clearly trying to appear composed, but it was no use. The wetland had turned the construction area into a quagmire that defied human intervention. I imagined him muttering to himself, "Why didn't anyone tell me wetlands fight back?" As the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting a golden glow over the chaotic scene, I sat on my porch and took it all in. The wetland had escalated from minor disruption to full-blown dominance. The HOA had resources, money, and planners, but they were no match for the cunning, persistent, and relentless force of nature. And I had the front row seat, witnessing a slow-motion victory of frogs, beavers, birds, and mud against human arrogance. I closed my notebook and whispered to myself, "If you thought this was bad, just wait. The grand finale hasn't even begun yet." By the 7th day, the construction site was nothing short of a disaster movie set. The HOA had exhausted every resource they could throw at the problem, yet the wetland continued to dominate every inch of territory they attempted to claim. I watched from my porch, notebook in hand, as chaos unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated performance. Only this one starred mud, water, and wildlife, with humans floundering helplessly in the supporting role. The first sign that nature was ready to deliver its ultimate blow came with a heavy overnight rain. It wasn't just a drizzle, it was a torrent that transformed the partially paved road into a slippery river of mud. Water filled trenches, pooled entire tracks, and seeped into every corner of the construction site. A bulldozer, which had stubbornly survived earlier skirmishes, now groaned and sank up to its axles. Workers scrambled to stabilize it, slipping and cursing, but it was too late. Nature had claimed the day. The beavers, tireless and industrious, had taken advantage of the rising waters to reinforce their dams, diverting the flow into newly dug trenches. I swear they were almost gleeful, watching their handiwork cause maximum disruption. Birds continued to dive and swoop with precise timing, landing on machinery and scattering construction materials. Frogs croaked like conductors of an orchestra, coordinating the chaos below. Even the turtles seemed to take on a strategic role, slowly advancing across muddy paths to undo what little progress had been made. HOA members tried everything. Engineers arrived with sandbags, planks, and blueprints, only to watch their work collapse within hours. One suggested using heavy machinery to stabilize the embankments, but half of it was already stuck in mud from previous days. Another proposed temporary barriers, which were promptly washed away by the rising water or dismantled by clever beaver intervention. I couldn't help but narrate it to myself. Ladies and gentlemen, the wetland is undefeated. Human ingenuity meets amphibian superiority. By mid-morning, the road was effectively gone. Gravel and dirt had slid into mud pools, trenches overflowed, and the few machines still operational were immobilized by the softening ground. Workers moved cautiously, attempting to salvage tools or materials, but each step seemed to invite another setback. One unlucky crane operator nearly tipped his vehicle while trying to adjust a steel beam, only to be rescued by a crew member who slipped right behind him. I laughed quietly, partly from relief and partly from the sheer absurdity of it all. The HOA president arrived, his usual composure in tatters. Mud streaked his clothes, his clipboard was soggy, and he looked like he had aged a decade in a single morning. He attempted to direct operations, pointing and gesturing, but the wetland had rendered him irrelevant. He slipped into a trench, narrowly avoiding a pool of water, and muttered something about unforeseen circumstances that sounded more like a prayer than a plan. As I observed the scene, I realized the wetland's revenge was complete. The road they had envisioned as progress was now a twisted mess of mud, water, and abandoned machinery. Wildlife roamed freely, unbothered by humans, and even the air seemed charged with the satisfaction of victory. It was chaotic, yes, but in a strangely beautiful way, a testament to the power of nature when underestimated. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance, some taking photos, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I overheard one woman whisper, "I didn't know wetlands could be so vengeful." I smiled. That was exactly the point. Humans had assumed control, but the wetland had shown that patience, resilience, and a little creativity could achieve what brute force never could. By evening, the sun set over the flooded, chaotic site, casting golden light over mud, water, and scattered debris. Birds perched triumphantly on abandoned equipment, frogs croaked their evening symphony, and beavers worked quietly along their dams. I closed my notebook and took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of awe. The HOA had learned, in the hardest way possible, that nature cannot be bullied. I walked back to my porch and reflected on the week. Progress, as defined by humans, had failed spectacularly. The wetland, however, had thrived. It had defended itself with cunning, persistence, and a little humor of its own, and I had been there to witness every glorious moment. I whispered to myself, if you ever think you can bulldoze a wetland, think again, because sometimes nature doesn't just fight back. Sometimes she wins, and in style. By the 8th day, the chaos had quieted. Not because the wetland had stopped fighting, but because it had won. The road the HOA had dreamed of constructing no longer existed, just a muddy, waterlogged expanse where machinery sat abandoned, half submerged in soft earth. Birds perched on toppled equipment as if guarding the spoils, frogs croaked proudly from their muddy thrones, and the beavers quietly inspected their handiwork with what I swear was satisfaction in their little beady eyes. Nature had not just defended itself, it had triumphed. I walked through the site for the first time since the grand finale, careful not to slip in the mud, and I couldn't help but smile. Every footprint, every tire track, every human attempt at domination had been countered in its own subtle, brilliant way. What the HOA had considered progress had been transformed into a lesson in humility. The wetland wasn't just a patch of land, it was a living entity, resilient, cunning, and completely indifferent to human arrogance. Neighbors had started wandering over, cameras in hand, to document the aftermath. Some were cheering, some were shaking their heads, and a few were quietly whispering apologies for ever supporting the HOA's plan. I even overheard one of the board members mutter, "Well, maybe we underestimated the wetlands." Understatement of the year, I thought, but I let it slide. There was no need to rub it in. Nature had already done that beautifully. As I walked along the water's edge, I saw the frogs performing their nightly chorus, turtles basking lazily on reclaimed logs, and birds swooping gracefully over the now flooded roadbed. Even the beavers had resumed their normal activities, nibbling on branches and reinforcing their dams with calm efficiency. Everything had returned to balance, the wetlands fully restored to their natural glory. And for the first time all week, I felt a sense of peace. I reflected on what had happened over the past 8 days. The HOA had believed that polite warnings, committee meetings, and blueprints could overcome the living, breathing complexity of the wetland. They had ignored my emails, laughed at my warnings, and assumed that human determination could bend nature to its will. They had learned, in the most dramatic fashion possible, that nature doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't apologize. It simply exists, and when pushed, it defends itself with persistence, patience, and cunning precision. Of course, I had my own reflections too. I realized that being a witness wasn't enough. I had spent years caring for this wetland, documenting its rhythms, observing its inhabitants, and advocating for its protection. Without that preparation, who knows how much worse things could have been. Nature needed a champion, even a small, slightly eccentric one like me, to give it a voice when humans ignored it. And I was proud to have played that role. Humor had also carried me through. Watching humans slip in mud, machinery sink into trenches, and the HOA flounder in vain was a reminder that arrogance often comes with comic timing. I had laughed, yes, but I had also learned something. Sometimes the most effective strategy isn't confrontation, it's observation, patience, and letting nature do the work. It's not just revenge, it's justice, slow but inevitable. By evening, the site had settled into quiet calm. Birds roosted, frogs croaked softly, and the sun cast long shadows across the flooded area, turning mud and water into a shimmering canvas. I stood on my porch and looked over my wetland, feeling both pride and relief. The HOA had been humbled, the wetlands restored, and I had learned a lesson that no committee, spreadsheet, or bulldozer could ever teach. I whispered to myself, half in awe, half in humor, let this be a warning to anyone who thinks progress means paving over life. Nature doesn't beg, it doesn't negotiate, and it certainly doesn't forgive easily. And with that, I walked back inside, notebook under my arm, already thinking about the next chapter. Watching this sanctuary thrive undisturbed, a little paradise that had stood its ground, and won. Because sometimes, the most satisfying victories are quiet, patient, and unstoppable. And sometimes, the frogs, turtles, birds, and beavers are the ones teaching humans the lesson of a lifetime. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.